inviting me, and it's nice to be here. I'm really going to give you 2 papers for these 2 talks. I mean, partly because I don't have the depth and breadth of scholarship that Eddie presented before. But I wanted to extract a little bit of, these are 2 quite different papers, and so they might seem unrelated. They're connected by a set of concerns. And I just wanted to spend a bit of time on what are these concerns and how I think they can be, they enrich the applied theory papers that we can write, and that they could, they also take them a little closer to applications. And so I think these concerns should be and could be, show up more broadly. And this concern is basically an uneasiness whenever we do Bayesian mechanism design with the assumption that, if we're thinking about design, and with the economist as an engineer, it's kind of one of the appealing aspects of mechanism design is it puts the economist in a position not of only positively describing the world, but possibly coming up with something useful. It's the assumption that whoever the economist is interacting with in trying to figure out what's the problem, what do we believe, which would we do, what are the goals, the assumption that whoever we're talking to really has a well-specified set of beliefs about the environment. Okay, and actually, it's not clear that they have. And this is sort of the place I want to begin with. Many of the, if you think of designing contracts, designing tax schemes, one of the really successful places for mechanism design that has connected with application is public finance, in a sense. This is a place where, fairly involved trade-offs about agents' decision-making and social objectives have connected to, an empirical literature and perhaps at some point policy recommendations. Other environments are auctions and market designs. And many of those involve uncertain trade-offs between provided incentives for more effort and, providing better insurance to the agent. Trade-off between incentives and efficiency, trade-offs and incentives versus profit. I can give a bigger share of my output to the workers, but since they have limited liability, that's going to cut into my profits. Obtaining versus using information. If you tell me something and you're worried about how I'm going to use it, you might tell me less, but then, if I'm not using it, it's not very useful. These are all trade-offs and that are hard to that are uncertain, and it's always a little tricky to say, well, the decision maker has a well-specified, beliefs about the relevant parameters of the world, and you could start thinking about this from a reveal preference perspective and say, well, maybe he can't state a probability distribution, but if he can make choices, then maybe I can back out beliefs from that. But that's also tricky, because if you want to extract belief about types, you must basically ask the decision maker what are his beliefs about the outcome of games. Basically, you have to offer, propose choice problems that involve games being played. And then if he has preference over the games to be played, he doesn't, he knows what mechanism he wants to run in some sense. There is a little bit of tension there. I think that part is kind of interesting, because if you think about this reveal preference aspect of mechanism of how do I get the decision maker's beliefs about the type spaces and the type distributions, you are asking, the way you would do that is kind of by asking him what mechanisms does he like or not, and in some sense, that validates the idea that sometimes it's okay to say, well, I kind of like this mechanism, I just like this mechanism. And in some sense, I'm indirectly expressing some belief about the environment which make me like that mechanism that may be hard to actually pinpoint as a belief about the environment, but it still needs to be respected as a preference that's voiced in some sense. All right. Okay. This is not working anymore. All right. once you start with this, once you say, well, I'm uncomfortable thinking that I can elicit beliefs about the environment from decision maker, there are sort of two directions you can go. The first one is sort of kind of give up about eliciting, fully specified beliefs. Possibly you could extract restrictions, so basically moments. Maybe I can't, so I'm going to talk about a repeated dynamic contracting problem. Maybe I can't ask you about, the correct stochastic process that the agent controls, but maybe I can ask you about, I can get a moment such as a lower bound to potential surplus. Okay, that would be a moment that I can extract from the decision maker. Okay, and then whatever, then you have some restriction on the environment that the decision maker is willing to place. Maybe he could say, I believe that there is probability at least 30% that the surplus is above some lower bound. Okay, and under those restrictions, what you can do is solve some version of a minimax problem, and provide a minimax optimal mechanism or contract, or alternatively, you could go into the game of providing bounds and exhibiting a mechanism that satisfies bounds, efficiency bounds that you are going to argue are attractive or not. And I feel there is value to both. In some sense, when you exhibit a mechanism and you say, this mechanism that I like satisfies these bounds, I'm vague because I can't be more specific about this, but I think it's a useful conversation to have. When you optimize on a really simple model, on a relatively simple model, optimization is a little bit like overfitting. It has a lot of value because it makes sure that you're not missing some set of strategies that are actually quite reasonable and give you a lot of value. So it's a necessary step. But it also has the feature that if your model is relatively simple, you're optimizing to a slightly simple environment. So I find it useful as a complement to ask the question, okay, here is what the unrestricted mechanism can achieve. Is it reasonable? Is it not? What would be a plausible seeming implementation? And also ask the question, what share of this can be achieved by, intuitively, introspectively feasible mechanisms. And I think when you do this, you kind of express indirectly some belief about the environment, about, maybe it's a belief about bounded rationality, maybe it's a belief, you're expressing some belief. And we have natural intuition in terms of mechanisms, of contracts, because these are the things we really see in the world. We don't frequently think as modelers. We think as, but anyway, right, I'm going to stop this. There is a growing literature that takes on this route. One of the things I want to highlight, one of the really big values of solving an exactly optimal minimax design problem, and for instance, that's what Gabriel Carroll does in two recent papers, and he is, and also solving them with optimality, with objectives that are sort of the objectives that decision theory has made standard for us, is that then your model of contracting or mechanism design can be picked up as a model of a decision maker and nested into a bigger model. So I'm going to talk about linear contracts essentially, and doing replicating linear contracts with limited liability. I have some optimality result there, but that has a funny looking optimality criterion. Gabriel has a much more standard optimality criterion and kind of a neater intuition behind it, and that makes his model much more portable for use by macroeconomists, people who do corporate finance, etc. So between these two things, between solving an exact optimality problem and just providing bounds, one of the really big advantages of solving a problem and solving a relatively standard problem is that other people will be better able to pick up on it. The second route, and these are not exclusive routes, is to say, well, okay, I don't have beliefs, but maybe I have data, and provided I have enough data, I don't really care where I come from, where is my posterior, where is my prior, my posterior will converge to whatever I can identify. And this is really all of policy evaluation. So all the people who do development, the people who do labor, they are interested in mechanism design in some sense. When Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee think of of mechanisms to get better, more truthful reporting about environmental practices at Indian plants, and they're experimenting with different things, they're doing mechanism design in some sense, and they're doing prior-free mechanism design. They're getting data. They don't start with beliefs. They get data, and in some sense, the metric of outcome that they get tells them what to do. This is also what people do in public finance, what people do in I/O. And this is what basically this leaves you with, in a sense, is as part of your applied theory paper, you're going to nest an inference problem at the end of it. You're going to say, well, there is some set of data that I think could be observable. What are the inferences I could draw from this data? And can this let me make a decision on some of those trade-offs that are not obvious? Okay, this has worked quite well in the I/O literature, for instance. Starting with Lafont, actually, being able to estimate, to invert from bids a value distribution, and from that compute reservation values. You can think of that as an application of saying, well, I didn't start with a belief about what was the distribution of the values, but I have a theory of what would be the optimal reservation price as a function of the distribution of values, and the data lets me pin this down. Okay, so I think there's I think it's an useful perspective to keep when we write an applied theory papers. How could I, if I really were to pitch somebody on this, how would I identify the parameters that need to be identified? The two are not opposed. I don't think this is. No, this is. The two approaches are not opposed, because in many settings you won't get point identification of everything you care about. You'd get some set identification. You'll say, the data tells me that I have to be, in one of these many worlds, and then with that gives you some restrictions, some moment restrictions on the environment, and then you can go back to robust design within those restrictions. So the two are not unrelated. Okay. And that's really what I'm going to give you two papers that are only related because of this concern. One is this paper on dynamic contracting, and the question is, I have an arbitrary dynamic environment. I can have arbitrary persistence, and it doesn't need to be ergodic. How would I go about building contracts that have good efficiency properties? Good in what sense? Is the fact that I'm not doing exact Bayesian optimality, does that prevent me from talking about some of the things we care about, like renegotiation proofness? So this is going to be a paper on dynamic contracting. And the second one is going to be a really applied paper on basically on collusion, on whistleblowing and intimidation of whistleblowers. And there it's interesting for me because it's really something you couldn't do by doing a bunch of randomized control experiments, because there you really don't observe the objective function, which is crime in some sense. There is some amount of misdeeds, of wrongdoing going on. And because people want to hide it, it's very hard to get, metrics on the observables you really care about. And one of the questions is the naturally occurring data, which is going to be complaints data, which is sort of unverifiable, could be manipulated, people could be complaining for malicious reasons. Is there a way to use this data to start doing policy evaluation in this sense? Okay. All right. Yes?
Could I ask a methodological question, which you're free to
ask back to you, or?
No, well, historically there have been two different approaches to solving decision problems where you're not sure about the probability distribution, where there's a lot of uncertainty. One is the Maximin approach, which is sometimes associated with Pascal. Another is the principle of insufficient reason associated with Laplace, where basically you assign as flat a prior as you can at a uniform prior, and it doesn't seem to me that in this literature the Laplacian approach has been taken very much. It is used in computer science to evaluate algorithms. Is there some reason for that?
No, so there are connections. So whenever your problem is sufficiently convex, you have the min-max theorem, you can switch the order, and you'll get a prior under which whatever is min-max optimal is just base optimal in some sense. But it's a funny prior, and I don't know that it has to be Laplace prior.
It typically won't be.
I don't know. Yeah. So introspectively, I don't. It's cruel to give me French people to cite French people to me, especially in public. But
you're free. This is not a question.
I don't know sufficient. So I'm gonna give you two responses. The first one is, at least Max-Min has some decision theoretic foundations that I'm reasonably familiar with. I don't know the decision theoretic foundations for Laplace, for instance. And maybe there are some. I don't know. Maybe Steve.
It's grain of truth arguments. You start with some prior, and then by learning or by whatever evolutionary process, you get to something reasonable out of there.
But in some way, you don't. I mean, Laplace is not any prior that's sufficient. That's basically, it depends on the space. First, how expensive is that assumption, and anything that has some density over the is going to be fine, right? So the grain of truth is very weak, and grain of truth for me matches this. It's basically saying, well, if you get a bunch of data, well, then that's going to identify something. Maybe not a point, but I'm going to identify something, and you can at least take a restriction to that. Laplace, I don't know, like the specificity of Laplace, that it's, but is this what you have in mind?
So Sergio was asking where Laplace has been used in computer science. So if you look at worst case scenarios, which is like Max and Min, simplex algorithm works very badly in linear programming. And so people were puzzled by the fact that in practice it works very well. And so there's an alternative comparison between simplex method and other methods, which basically average over parameter values rather than looking at worst case scenarios. And the question is, do we have anything like that for mechanisms?
I don't have a strong conviction about that. I have a strong conviction that whatever moments you think you can extract, so whatever restrictions, so I think, fully sophisticated decision maker is extreme, but I do think we're able to through choice problems, extract some restrictions on the environment, and I think this much we should do. I don't have much further insight on this. Regret aversion gets a bad press among theorists who are not, who don't have a background in statistics or computer science. Chuck Munsky always talks about it, likes it very much for a number of reasons. All these guys are very much all the statistical criteria that they use to decide whether a policy is good or bad is very much regret aversion. So they never do max. I mean, when you think of a t-statistic, it's who doesn't know what a t-statistic is? Okay, you know what a t-statistic. Okay, everybody knows. It penalizes by the uncertainty over the default option. So it's very much it's a referent dependent choice rule. It's not transitive. So there are good reasons not to like it, but that's very much how the people who do this in practice behave. All right. It's not an answer to the question, but it's a point about choice theory. All right. I kind of want to hear this discussion, Okay. All right. Okay, so here's an example of how these concerns show up and affect the way you think about a problem that's, that's typically that's very difficult, that will make it more difficult, and then compromises on a bunch of things that are kind of important, but you compromise anyway, so that you can start groping towards an answer. Here's the problem. You have an agency problem between an investor and a manager. It's going to be a really simple economy. You can think of it as an apple tree economy, and it's really I'm a landowner, and I'm taking advice from I'm potentially taking advice from a farmer, or letting a farmer work on my land. I'm not going to have intertemporal savings. All that's produced in a period has to be eaten today. The apples rot otherwise. There is no cider making technology. So you have this agency problem between the investor and the manager. The manager either has information to start with about the whole sequence of future states, or can acquire, as the game goes, information. He could also take actions that correspond to expanding costs, to acquiring information, or to making investment opportunities available. And so I'm throwing at it a whole lot of difficulties. There's going to be limited liability on the side of the manager. A poor man's version of risk aversion. So you can't delay all the payments to the end. You don't want to eat a bunch of apples when you retire. You want to eat apples every day. And I'm going to allow for arbitrary and persistent processes for the underlying states. For instance, it could be that the manager has access to good investment opportunities for a while, and then doesn't have them anymore. That's a good example of non-stationarity. We very much live in a non-stationary world. If you, it depends what time scale, but if you, it's one of these figures that's kind of amazing. If you look at the 10-year yield for U.S. debt, it tops in 82. It's at 16%. It's a nominal yield. It's at 16% in 82. It's at 4% in 62, and it's at a bit above 2 today. And what that tells you is that basically we can go through 40 years of if you lived in that period, if you are my age, you basically think that interest rates do only one thing: they go down, right? And so you have all of the finance industry that exists today. Basically, all their models are back tested with that data, and so they sell you. One thing that they do that corresponds to this is, I shouldn't get into this, but something that looks very good for that is something called risk parity. Is basically you weigh your asset allocation to the inverse of volatility. You put a lot of weight on bonds. It's been great for this whole period because yields go down. And no concerns about non-stationarity in some sense. and that's really what I'm worried about in this paper, is that the environment that you made, that the contract that you want must be okay even in a very non-stationary environment. You could have an asset manager that was great for 15 years, and now the environment has changed. We are no longer in a decreasing yield environment. He might start sucking for a long time. Okay. All right. Plus, the usual dimensions of moral hazard and adverse selection. The papers makes a bunch of compromises, so I'm going to have patient players with a long horizon. I'm going to give up on base optimality, and I'm going to have only the most stylized of risk aversion. In exchange for that, you get some stuff. So first, I'm going to offer you a class of contract that's going to be very intuitive, that are going to achieve approximate efficiency. And efficiency is going to be, in a sense, to be determined, because I don't have a Bayesian framework, that are going to provide general performance guarantees. And even though I've given up on a lot of the usual stuff, I'm still going to be able to talk about renegotiation proofness in a meaningful way. And renegotiation proofness is a really important problem in financial contracting. So if you are a hedge fund manager, you're paid on a high watermark contract. That basically says that if your fund dips, you don't get paid anymore until you make up your losses. A lot of what happens is, if you dip a little too much, but your track record is good overall, you'll renegotiate. You'll say, well, with this current contract, I can't, pay my employees. I don't have enough incentives to work. I would just shut down and restart. So let's not do that. Let's just renegotiate. And so this concern about renegotiation of proofness is a relevant one. All right. So what's the principal agent problem? I have n periods, patient players, no discounting. If you have discounting, you can make things work, but it just takes discounting needs to go to 1. The discount factor needs to go to 1 for things to work out. The agent takes some action every period. A is a convex set, and you can think of this as an allocation. So it's if this was land being cultivated, it would be a split of the land. If it's a portfolio management problem, it's a split of your portfolio into different asset classes. Okay? Convex, compact, both of which are important. The payoffs, so your payoffs today is just the dot product of the action that's taken and the returns to every asset. So R lives in RK, and I'm imposing that the payoffs be bounded. It basically says I'm imposing that the payoffs be bounded. Okay? And this is the poor man's version of risk aversion. These are the agent's preferences for consumption. So he can't consume negative amounts, and he's satiated at some amount of consumption W bar, and he's linear in between. So it's concave. But what that basically says is it will do two things for me. It would imply two things that you could just impose on the contract. First, limited liability. You can't take stuff away from the agent, otherwise he's just very, very unhappy he doesn't work with you. And the second one is payments need to be made as you go. Yeah, I'll come to you. And give me a second, let me just finish this, I'll come to you. Payments need to be made as you go. In these dynamic contracting problems, if the two have the same discount factor, or if the agent has a higher discount factor than the principal, you often want to delay paying him till the end, because then you have all the information, so it's more efficient to delay to the end to pay him. And this is what this prevents. Basically, you have to pay him as you go because, I need to function every day and not just be rich at the end. Okay. And
just a clarifying question. So what's on the axis of the graph?
This is a utility function. Sorry. On the x-axis, it's consumption by. So this is the utility function of the agent. This is consumption by the agent, and this is his utility. Okay. And this is expressing two things: limited liability and satiation. This is saying I don't get more after I've reached some satiation level. It doesn't make me happier to eat more. What this is going to impose is what this is going to let me do is it's going to basically let me transfer things. It's going to make it free for me to transfer payments across periods, provided that all payments are within these two bounds. and then super expensive to go below that, and super expensive to go above that. Okay, so it's sort of a brute force way to, through preference, to get to a contract that will have bounded payments in every period and has limited liability. So you look puzzled. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So really the W bar comes from the last bullet, and then you say, by
It can be above. It can be above.
Payoffs in one period will never exceed it, because if they exceed it, don't matter. It doesn't matter.
Exactly.
I know it's confusing. But it's
Start with that. Start with this one, and then say that this is within this one.
bullet. That makes sense.
Okay.
That's an example of something.
Right. Okay. So what is the agent's value added? So by himself, the principal has access to some, let's say, publicly available information filtration, and is going to be able to choose some allocation strategy that's going to be, whatever. Measurable. That's going to yield a default payoff process, and this is basically what I could do on my own. Okay, so on my own, I would have one type of crop, or on my own, I would invest things in a passive index, the MSCI World. This is a counterfactual that can always be computed, and it's important. So that's for this construction, it's important. You can change that. So the tools that I'm going to use are tools from the literature on online optimization, and the version that I'm using is going to require feedback, so that I observe what would have been the counterfactual. You can do it without feedback, then you have to randomize what you try.
Computed means the distribution.
What?
Computed means you can compute the distribution.
No, you can compute. You can always know what would have been your counterfactual performance. So if what I would have done on my own is invest in the MSCI World,
But it's a random variable. What do you mean?
exposed, it can be computed. So to at the end of the period, I get to observe what is the realized return for that period.
Okay,
For
so
the
it's part of
content,
filtration in some sense.
it's part of the filtration. That's completely fine.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's not always true. Like if you think of investment let's say it's true for for investment strategies, but it's not for investment in public stocks, because there would be a public price quoted for the stock, but it's not true for, let's say, how do you call that, venture capital. If I, as a venture capitalist, I don't invest in the project, I don't get to see its counterfactual performance. Would that company have worked without me or not? It's with me. I don't get to see whether that company would have worked with me or not. You can deal with this. You just have, you have to randomize, which I'm slightly uncomfortable with, but formally you can deal with it. Okay, what the agent does is the agent is going to invest in information acquisition. Okay, so and here I'm going to stay loose in terms of generating signals. He can. This is some cost, and that's going to generate, some signals, forming some filtration. It's the collection of information that you've seen so far. I'm assuming that you don't forget what you've seen, and it's just, it's the, sigma algebra generated by the signals that you see. Okay, and here I'm just saying that the cost gives rise to some, I'm indexing the signals by the cost you've paid for them. That gives rise to some alternative, information structure. And the agent can choose any allocation that's adaptive to this endogenous information structure. And that leads to a returns process, WT. Yes?
One signal per turn. One signal per period.
I haven't told you anything about what space this lives in, so this is arbitrary dimensional.
You index them with T.
I work in discrete time, so I'm working in discrete time. But here,
at each period, you can invest and get a signal.
yes, but this is without loss of generality. And I'm not telling you. And now I can tell you about the probability space. what you have is the state space is basically the sequences of returns. This is really what you care about in terms of things you can eat. And this is, these are the signal structures that you are getting, the signal that you are getting. So the realized state for my world is basically the entire sequence of signals and returns. And I'm putting any probability space on this. So you could have a signal today that's correlated with returns in 5 periods. Okay, it's arbitrarily general. Okay, here is the assumption. It's already been made. There was already an assumption in from the fact that W was bounded, but I just want to state it because this shows up explicitly. It's a bounded difference assumption. It's saying that for any two allocations, the difference that the allocation made is bounded within the period. Okay? So it's saying that it's saying is that basically getting the allocation wrong one period can't count for a lot overall. So it's small compared to n in some sense. If n is a horizon, this is saying that the difference that one allocation can make is small compared to the horizon. This one is tricky in some sense. This one, it's a real assumption, especially if you think about investment. If your advisor is pushing you to basically insure the world, that's an easy way to generate returns every day for 10 years. Then this assumption may not be satisfied. Okay? So.
The bulk RT is the whole process of RT? What's bulk RT?
No, I suck. The fact that it has a T means it's just one period, and it's R. I apologize for this. I'm being inconsistent. It's just to mention that this is a vector because you have a return for every asset. But it's inconsistent between these two, and there is no reason for them to be inconsistent.
So that's just a one period effect?
It's just a one period effect.
Okay. Because it said something on the effect in the future.
No, I said effects about information today may be correlated to returns in the future. Here I'm just saying this is really an assumption, and what's going to be meaningful for the results is that this bound, basically how wrong things can go in one period, the difference between what you do and what was optimal, is going to be small compared to the entire horizon. Otherwise, you can't learn in some sense. So otherwise, you can't learn what's the optimal thing. If you can kill yourself in one period, you can't really quite learn. Okay, Vasiliki, you had a question. Returns can be negative. There is no problem with negative returns. Allocations could be negative as well. Things need to be bounded. Yeah. Okay, so no ergodicity. I have okay. So an agent strategy is going to be a choice of costs of information acquisition efforts adapted to the information he has already acquired. So I may buy a data set, do some backtesting, and decide to continue buying this data set. So it's measurable, it's a dynamic strategy itself, and investment decisions. And the agent is going to maximize the following objective. He's getting payouts from the principal pi. He has discussed CT, and he maximizes his expected surplus. Payments have to depend on public history. The constraint, and it's really a result given the assumption that I've made about the agent's preferences here. What I'm not doing, I could put a U of this, a U of pi minus CT with U, the shape that I described before. But it's equivalent to imposing the following constraints: that you have limited liability, the payments from the principal have to be positive, and that they are going to satisfy this property, but that they have to be bounded above by some fixed amount. Okay? Really, the way I'm going to do them is the pi sharing is going to be sufficient. It's going to be sufficient to only share the apples. You don't have to, share apples that you don't have. Okay. And I'm going to assume full commitment, but I'm going to talk a bit about weak renegotiation proofness. I can't talk about strong renegotiation proofness. Did I forget someone? Who? Farrell has 2 R's. I'm going to cite Mascolel at some point, and I don't know how many L's he has, you know. It's a small revenge for a Frenchman whose name has been mispronounced, you know, by Americans for many years. Okay. Basically, weak renegotiation is going to accept the existence of the contract and say that you can only renegotiate to applying the same contract but at a different history. So I'm not going to be able to think about what other contract could be better because I lack in some sense the notion of optimality that would let me do that. But I can talk about at least within the same contract. Would you prefer to pretend that we didn't have this big loss? Yes?
Just like WT is publicly observable to both principal and
Yes, that's fine.
Not just WT0, you said, but also
WT0 is the
what
one.
you don't know is for things where A is 0 in some sense. You had something where you said there are things you don't observe. What are those? Or they are not in the model. You said.
So the principal doesn't only observe his public information, doesn't observe the private information acquired by the agent. He doesn't, so that's essentially it. He doesn't observe the cost expenditure of the agent.
He observes the returns on each asset.
Exactly, everything else is public.
Okay, so that's for WT. But he doesn't observe the A. He doesn't know the allocation.
He doesn't need to observe the allocation.
So how does he know?
He could observe the allocation.
W? He only knows.
He knows his account. He sees his account position at the end.
His account doesn't know how this account makes. So
Yeah.
if Madoff writes arbitrary numbers, he won't see it.
What?
If Madoff writes arbitrary numbers, that he won't know.
That's correct. So I'm assuming honest reporting of the current valuation, because you need to optimize. One of the things that's going to happen is you're going to have to change the amount that you let the managers manage. So I'm going to say, well, you've just lost a bunch of money. I'm going to have to slowly reduce the amount you're managing. And so if I'm getting a false version of the world where things keep going up, I'm never going to give Bernie Madoff less money. I'm always going to keep let him manage all my money. That make sense? So of course I don't need to observe AT, although I could. I don't need to observe RT necessarily. I certainly need to observe WT and WT0. Okay, just a bit of reference. So there is a related literature about near optimal mechanism design or contract design with patient players, but that mostly assumes ergodicity. So it doesn't have to be ID, but that mostly assumes ergodicity. And the feeling of those, so Jackson, Sonnenschein are choice problems, Radner, Rubinstein is more of a contracting framework. But really, the notion of those is that the way they work is, because you have ergodicity, you really know what should be happening. You have a prior, you have ergodicity, you really know what should be the observed realization of outcomes. So in terms of, if it's a contracting relationship, you know that the patterns of output should be, the mean output, the mean realized output should converge to the expectation. In Jackson and Sonnenschein, it's a little different. It's I'm claiming how much I care about something, and we want to do what's socially efficient. If the frequency at which I claim something that my preference is strong should start, the empirical frequency should start matching the expected frequency ex ante. Okay, so these are sort of related approaches, but they rely very much on ergodicity. The classic stuff is not only relies on doesn't necessarily rely on ergodicity, but it relies on being able to compute continuation values precisely, and so on knowing the process precisely. The literature that's really connected, and we'll see this in the methods, is the literature on testing experts. The positive part, there is a mostly negative literature on testing experts, but there is a, Olszewski and Pesky is an example that says, well, and if you come from statistics, it's a fairly standard result. It says that, well, of course you have, if you might not always select the people who are correctly informed, but you will be able to select the people who have something valuable to contribute. All right. How much time do I have?
43 minutes.
I'll finish early then, hopefully. All right. So here's how I'm going to work. I'm going to work in two steps. I'm going to work in, yes?
So I'm getting slightly ahead of you here, but in your paper you are analyzing the benchmark contract to calculate the shared parameter of the linear contract using this ratio of the effort costs and the output. And I understand how you do that, and it's connected with what Carol does in his paper. But when you're constructing the calibrated incentive contracts for the topic you study in the paper, I don't quite understand what the informational environment is for the principal. And so what is the basis that he uses to calculate the shared parameter for the calibrated incentive contract?
It's orthogonal. I mean, you're right in some sense. You start off with the, so he's basically going to the end of the talk, but it's not a bad time to address now. I'm going to go up in two completely orthogonal steps in some sense. The first step is going to argue that basically linear contracts that are not feasible for me because they're high liability contracts. I'm going to need to suck money from the guy. Are going to be optimal in some sense, provided that you can put some restriction on the environment. That's when you get the piece rate. Forget about that. That gives me a point that is kind of optimal in some sense. Anything I can do with the same notion of optimality with more restricted contracts is going to have to be below. And what I'm telling you is that you can approach it. Okay, so there are two steps. So first, set up a high liability benchmark contract. Argue that it's attractive. Step two, show that it can be approached with limited liability, not knowing the environment. Okay, and so the alpha, the piece rate that you get in this setting is, I don't know where you get it from. Like you get it from the restriction of the environment that you're willing to put in the first place.
So do you start with the restriction that's like what you do when you're talking about the max and
Yeah, I mean this was the point. Is I have in mind that you've started with this. You've said, here is an acceptable piece rate. I can't quite implement high liability. But what you've done is you've reduced the, instead of going to a decision maker and asking, what do you believe about the environment, about the process that he controls, what is the likelihood that he stops being informed, you've boiled it down to one question, like what do you think is a reasonable share of the surplus for him to get? It would be interesting to talk to the people who, in the practice of eliciting beliefs from decision makers is, what can we elicit with some decent consistency over time? I mean, one of the big problems when you ask questions is, you get answer A and then you ask the question again, 5 days later and you get answer B. So consistency within the same decision maker is just a big issue. So boiling things down to relatively simple questions. Anyway, all right. This was useful for one person and made everybody else confused. But all right. Two steps. First, I'm going to talk about one contract that's going to be useful as a benchmark, which is a high liability contract in which you can just reward the agent a share of his externality. Sometimes he does worse than what I would have done on my own. That means that he would need to give me money. This is not going to be implementable in practice. This is why we get to step two. How can I replicate the problem of how can I replicate the incentives of this initial contract? Okay. What's the benchmark contract? It's very simple. This is what I could do on my own. This is what I could do on my own. This is what the agent does for me. I'm going to pay the agent a share of his externality on me. Okay? And this has to have it's high liability because when the agent underperforms, he has to pay the principal. one of the really, especially if you're worried about finance, one of the really attractive properties of this is it satisfies this no loss property, which is there is no way for the agent to make money off of me without me profiting as well. If the agent is getting a positive expected surplus, so pi t minus ct, let's say he's not investing anything, he has a positive expected payoff, that means that the expectation of my return and of my gains are positive as well. Okay? The other part is that it's weekly renegotiation proof. So basically because it's independent on the past, I'm always rewarding the agent a fixed share of what's going on. I don't need to, there's nothing to renegotiate basically. It's a constant contract. Okay. Okay. I'm going to define this object. This is the maximum return. This is the maximum first best surplus you can get under the constraint that the average cost expenditure is less than C naught. It's basically maximizing over cost expenditure and allocation the surplus generated. There is also the surplus generated by a high liability contract with piece rate alpha. So it's given the cost expenditure and actions generated by the contract alpha. What is the expected return? In general, you need to have a selection of these. I've told nothing to you that would guarantee uniqueness of the solution. So I'm acting as if there is only one, but you really would have to do a selection. And I'm just defining a couple of notations. So these are the returns. This is the surplus generated for the principal when he gives a piece rate alpha. And this is the first best surplus when the cost is less than 0. And you have the following bound. It's basically the bound that says that when you give a piece rate alpha, you guarantee yourself something that's greater than the following. 1 minus alpha times the maximum over the average cost expenditures of the first best return for that cost expenditure minus distorted cost of the agent. If you can't have alpha to 0 or 1 because then these two things go in different direction. But that basically connects the returns you can expect with a piece rate alpha with the real physics of the problem, with what are the returns I can generate given a certain amount of costs. Okay, so if you tell me an environment, all right. So you have this efficiency bound basically. So if you put alpha equal to a half, you know that your return will be at least a half of the maximum returns I could get with a slightly increased surplus. Turns out
C0 is a virtual variable. Nobody controls that. I mean, the agent is not restricted. He can do whatever he wants.
he can do whatever he wants.
So he chooses his
He chooses C0.
C0.
Yes.
Okay.
Here, this is a first best problem. So basically, I'm telling you that you get a function out of the first best. That alpha gives you a function of the giving the agent a linear contract with piece rate alpha gives you a function of the first best. This is the shape of this result. Yes?
Sorry, so but the expectation is taken with respect to what?
So expectation here are always here in the consumption, the principal is irrelevant. The expectations are taken under the belief of the agent. He's the one who's in charge. He's the one who controls. Of course, if the principal and the agent have very different beliefs, and you let the agent do things, he might do things that are not very valuable for you. There are results in the paper that say that at the end, the contract that I'll give you will have the property that if the agent goes crazy for a while and so optimizes with a prior that's not the process from which the states are drawn, then you can, if it happens for an interval, then essentially you can, the performance you'll get is as good, almost as good as the one if you didn't listen to him when he goes crazy. I can't deal with him going crazy with weird patterns, but provided that he goes crazy for some well-structured set of states, histories, then that's fine. But it's a good point, since I'm not talking about beliefs of the principal, and I'm using expectations. Well, what are these expectations? Well, they're expectations under the beliefs of the agent. This no loss result, for instance, if the agent is doing something that's stupid for himself, he could hurt you as well, Okay, turns out that this bound is tight. This is the same bound that shows up in Gabriel's work, and okay, where does this bound come from? I think it's useful. It's just an optimality condition. If you think of C alpha as the average effort cost and A star the agent's policy under the high liability contract, for any other average effort cost he could use, consider the allocation that would maximize with this different effort cost. It has to be that what accrues to the agent under that alternative choice is less good than what he gets under his choice of the contract. So that says that for whatever effort cost that he could do, the return that so yeah, let me step back for a second. Optimality, this is the payoff of the agent when he does what's optimal under the high liability contract. This is just reweighting things a bit. It has to be better than the alternative payoff he could get by having a different average effort cost and doing what's then optimal for that average effort cost. You rearrange terms and then you get this lower bound on the returns accruing to the principal. Okay. Turns out that this bound is tight. The way I get it is I look at the following set of environments. So I'm going to talk about the first best surplus. This would be the cost expended at the first best surplus, the returns at the first best surplus. I can define the set of environments such that the ratio of the first best cost to the first best returns are less than some rho. And then the linear contract is, achieves the highest ratio of the first best surplus. The contract that gives you the highest guaranteed ratio of returns to the principal to first best surplus is a linear contract, and you choose the piece rate according to this ratio. So if you think that at first best it's plausible that you could have a ratio less than a half, then you get the linear contract with piece rate square root of a half as max min optimal in this sense. This is just an excuse to tell you that linear contracts are optimal in some sense. The no loss property was getting you part of there. Gabriel, I think, gets essentially the same result but a much neater setup, and I think it's the one that should be used for if you want to nest this model in a bigger exercise. I think it's the better model to use. It's just much more natural. I guess Jason Hartline will be here talking about ratios of performance, but it's something that most people object to. I don't know. All right. The name of the game now is I'm going to set this as my contract. I'm going to assume that all of you are super excited and you'd like to have your basically anybody you work with, be incentivized with a high liability contract where if they underperform, they pay you back. That's kind of I would like to have that contract with whoever manages my money. You can't do that. You have limited liability. You can't delay payments till the end. And now the name of the game is, can we approach this contract in a way that will, once we take incentive compatibility seriously, generate an investment process with similar outcomes. Okay? And what are the tools that are at my disposition? So I have access to a payment to the agent. It has to be between 0 and the money I have available in the period to pay him. And I'm going to add one new thing, which is how much do I trust him in any period? So what share of my assets is he managing in the period? Okay, so his advice is going to apply to this share lambda. Do you have a question? Lambda T is the share the agent control. That's going to be affected to is the share of the assets that the agent controls. It's going to affect it to the allocation he suggests. And 1 minus lambda T is going to go to the default allocation that the principal would have done on his own. Okay, and the question is, what I'm going to want to do is to dynamically set these two parameters to satisfy the two following properties of the linear contract. And these are the properties that make it work. You can show that any contract that satisfies these aggregate properties is going to achieve the same efficiency as the linear contract. The first one is saying that over time, I am paying the agent a share of his externality on me. So the sum of payments to the agent minus alpha, and then that's his externality on me, that's scaled by lambda, is equal to 0. If this is true, I'm going to have the no loss property. The second one cheap way to set no excess reward is I pay the agent 0 every period and I just don't give him anything to manage. Okay, then there's no problem, but it's not going to work. So you need a second property that says that the fact that I'm not trusting him completely is not impairing his ability to generate returns too much. And what that says is these are the foregone returns. This is the amount of money that I don't give him to manage, and this is what he contributes. Okay, so this sum is the amount of money that I lost by not trusting the agent, by not giving him my assets to manage. Yeah? If these two things work, then the contract is going to be fine. Okay? You're not going to be able to do this exactly. You're going to be able to do this approximately. All right? I'm going to add a little tiny thing related to.
You really want for every realization?
For every, I would like if this is true for every realization in the linear contract. This is true for every realization in the linear contract, right?
Yeah. No. Okay.
Because lambda is equal to 1 in the linear contract. Lambda is equal to 1, and this is just the contract. So this is true by construction in the high liability contract. I'm not going to be able to do this for every realization. I'm going to be able to do this approximately for every realization. Okay, and I'm going to want to do a little bit more. What?
That's what the bound enters.
Yes, that's where the bound enters. I'm going to want. I'm going to want to have a little bit more. What I'm telling you now is this is going to make your contract efficient from the perspective of period 0 if this is true. I want this from every history, right? I want my weak renegotiation proof net result. So I'm going to ask that this is be true for every starting point. Okay, for every starting history t prime between t prime and t, I want the same property. Maybe if there's a question, I should answer the question. I'm not going to run out of time. Okay, so I'm asking that this.
Okay, look, maybe it's a silly question. The WT is what the agent generates,
No, WT is so. WT is the assets of the principal at the end. Is the pair to the principal. So when you let the WT is lambda t AT RT plus 1 minus lambda t. That's not a weird this. A0t RT. WT is the total amount of apples you have at the end of the day. So it's the apples that were, raised by the agent on his plot of the farm, and the apples that were raised by you, that were produced by you on your plot of the farm. What?
It's lambda t times WT, so it can be the WT already has a lambda t inside. The WT is net, is not, and then you multiply by lambda t. I mean, also not consistent.
Yeah, you're right.
The
You're right.
return that you get
Yeah.
will be 1.
So-
and then you multiply by
No.
lambda t to get an idea.
You're right. My notation is screwed up.
Exactly. Now there's the lambda t of that. Plus 1 minus lambda t of that.
Thank you.
I'm still confused. Again, I apologize if it's a silly confusion. WT is what the agent
Would have generated if I trusted him completely. So this is really what I have at the end of the day.
You would have trusted me completely.
Exactly.
Lambda equal 1.
Yes? So this term, lambda t WT minus W0t, it's WT lambda minus W0t. Right? That's the difference between what I do get
It's the excess.
and what I could have got on my own. Okay.
Excess.
All right. Let's keep on this. You want to have the t prime, and that's going to, that's equivalent to this condition and then the max over starting points. This is not important. This is what's going to give me renegotiation proofness, but this is, I like it, but you don't have as many reasons as I do to like it. You can forget about this term when you see it. I'm going to treat this as an approachability problem. Basically, I can call this a number, I can give this a name, I can give this a name, and I want these two things to approach 0. So I'm going to call this a regret. So this is the payoff regret. This is how much I've mispaid the agent. This is how much surplus I've destroyed by not trusting him. So that's that's how much I don't trust him times what he generates in every period. My contract is going to work if I get these two numbers to be close to 0 for every realization. Okay? And now you can unroll approachability. I fiddle with the alpha just to get the tighter versions of it, but it doesn't really matter. You look at the vector of regrets, and you'll have approachability. Essentially, if you have the following gradient condition satisfied, if you look at the marginal regret, so I'm defining this vector of regret is the vector of the payoff regret and the performance loss regret. This tells me how much have I mispaid the agent, how much have I destroyed the potential surplus he can create. There's going to be a marginal regret that's accumulated. So that's the difference between my regret today and my regret to yesterday. And I want to set up the parameters of the environment such that whatever the realization of the basically of the returns of the payoffs, the marginal regret is looking to the inside of the vector of regrets, the accumulated regrets. This is a gradient condition. There is a really illuminate. I'll just try this thing. There is a really illuminating literature on this that I encourage you all to get into. But it's a very simple proof that if you find parameters of your contract such that whatever the realization today, you have this property satisfied, you're going to get your two regrets to be small. And the way it goes is, well, what is you take the norm, the square norm of the regrets. It's less than the square norm. Well, it is the square norm of the regrets yesterday plus the marginal regret. If you have a plus sign, you have to play with the convexity of this. Don't worry about this. You do the first order development. I mean, you expand this out. This is going to be the square norm of the stock of regrets, the square norm of the marginal regret, and then the dot product of the two. And if you look at this, what I'm doing is I'm choosing the parameters of my contract today. This I can't affect anymore. This has happened. This is the biggest thing, but this has happened already, so I can't do anything about it. This I can do a lot of stuff about, but it's very small. It's a square of a flow. And so the biggest thing that I can control is basically this product of a stock and a flow. Okay? And since if you have this approachability condition, then this is negative, and so this is going to be less than the sum of the marginal increases, the square of the marginal increases, and then that gives you that the norm of the regrets is of order square root of t. Okay, and this is where the bounded difference assumption plays. All right, and so now the question is, well, this is a really illuminating literature, so I encourage you, and since I can also cite my Scholar, and which is wrong L.
That's correct. That's correct.
It's amazing. A book that I like for students. The Foster and Vora review papers are really great. This is a really great book. This is a great paper on convergence to correlated equilibrium, but people can figure that on their own. It turns out that this contract approachability problem, that the no regret problem that I've defined, where I've basically clarified what are my incentives objectives, I've written them as regrets to be taken to zero, is approachable. What shape does it take? It's a really simple condition. You write this up. This is just some, some expression. And then you put together the terms that you don't control, and you want them to be multiplied by zero, essentially.
But this is in R2, right?
It's in R2. Yeah.
R2. It's
Yeah.
two-dimensional.
Yeah.
Okay. So you just are playing with one parameter, which is...
I have two parameters. I have the pi's, and two contractual parameters, the pi's and the lambda. I had two regrets.
Once you have the lambda, you have the pi.
Exactly. I had two regrets
Okay, it's clear.
that I wanted to take to zero. The pair of regret, the foregone payments, the foregone performance regrets. I have two parameters, the payments and the lambda. And you get the following thing. I pay you the positive part of your externality whenever I have no payment regret. And then I trust you the following thing. The positive part of foregone returns divided by the positive part of foregone returns plus the positive part of foregone returns here and here plus divided by the foregone returns plus the payment regret. What that means is, for instance, if I have small foregone returns, I didn't miss out much by not listening to you. But I've paid you more than I should have, so I have a payment regret. I've paid you a lot more than I should have. That means that basically you didn't pull your weight. The investment manager didn't pull his weight. I have to stop trusting him. Okay? And that's your contract. And then you need to do a little bit of work. So it gives you the following thing. It gives you no excess payments, and it gives you no foregone returns. Again, the fact that you have this for every starting point will give you a bit more, and will give you a flavor of renegotiation proofness. That is, the contract is going to have the same approximate optimality property after every history. And instead of having a 0 now, I have a square root of t. Okay? And you get the same approximate performance result that you're going to be. One thing you need to do is, if this was the benchmark contract you wanted to emulate, the cost of this is you're going to have to give him a little bit more incentives. Okay, because if he was just indifferent before, the fact that you have some gap in the quality of your incentives means that, well, now he might be indifferent. You might break the indifference on the wrong side. So you need him to give him a sliver more of incentives, and then you have the performance of the calibrated contract is approximately that of the high liability contract, and the other performance bounds are true as well. Okay. This point about the fact that you only had approximate incentives means that you need to give the agent. You need to target a slightly higher share of the surplus. It's related to Madarash and Pratt, and their point is again a point about over-optimization. Is a point about overfitting. What they say is that if you have some, in a large class of screening problems, multidimensional screening problems, the optimum becomes bad if you perturb the environment a little bit. Okay. And so you can make it robust by adding a little bit more incentives, and then you can perturb and it's going to be fine. It's a whatever. It's a whatever point. Okay? And that's essentially all I wanted to tell you about. I'm finishing very early, no? Yeah, I know, it's excellent. I'm going to tell you about 3 extensions that are easy and one that's hard. Extensions that are easy is because they use the same tools.
Sorry, can I say something?
Yes?
There is no issue here that you want to make the agent happy every period, not just in the long run, which was the point you were making, or I'm missing something?
Okay. This property, this efficiency property, is so it's in aggregate. So it's true that it's in aggregate.
Yeah.
It's true at every history.
You want every period to have the agent do the right thing, which means not just telling him, you said you want him to get an apple every day, not just to get the apples so many times.
Yes?
So you can modify it.
No, so that's satisfied here, right? Because in the payments, you only pay him the payments that you give him. You don't. He doesn't get an apple every day, but he doesn't get all the apples at the end. It's this payoff function. It's this utility. Sorry. It's this utility function. Right? You don't want to give him everything at the end because it's useless to him. He's just loaded with apples with nothing to do with them. That's what's limited liability. But within these 2 bounds, you can, I can eat an apple today, 2 apples tomorrow, 2 apples today, 1 apple tomorrow, an apple and a half today, an apple and a half tomorrow. This doesn't cost me anything in terms of efficiency. Once you start with
you may have big changes that are necessary per period, but because of that utility, the utility of the agent anyway is capped at that point.
Exactly.
So you don't have to give him. So you are sure you don't have to give him too much, even in one period, because once you go above,
you don't want to give him period, and you don't want to delay payments. This is kind of a constraint on contracts.
Yeah, okay.
If you don't have this, if you don't have cessation, what you want to do is delay all the payments to the end. You delay all the. You may want to do other things as well, but for sure, there is no reason to pay him at any point other than the end. Make sense? And that's the difficulty with clawbacks. Practically they talk about clawbacks. And a clawback basically means seizing assets from somebody. And there's a it's a high standard of proof to do that. Clawbacks are basically paying people at the end. Because you can't, basically the money is not yours to consume. Yeah. Okay. Discounting, screening, you can deal with. Discounting, it just means that the bound, instead of involving a square root of n, will involve the square root of the sum of delta t's.
What exactly do you mean by screening? Is that the problem?
Screening is, could you get agents who have nothing to contribute to just not participate? So people who don't have any advantage in managing my farm or my money, could I get them to not participate in the first place? And it's kind of, there are reasons to think it's tricky. There are some settings where it's provable that you can't screen. So Foster and Young have a paper in which you have linear expected risk neutrality, but you look at multiplicative returns, and there you can't screen anymore. Right? So here, if you were having an investment problem, but you had log utility for what happens at the end, then you could screen, but you can't screen in the version, whatever. There are environments where you can and can't screen. Multi-agent versions here I'm basically paying the agent a share of his externality. There's a flavor of VCG there, and you could apply this to doing VCG, for instance, with limited liability. So I want some action to be taken. I claim it's going to be good for my payoffs, but it's only good for my expected payoffs. My realized payoff could be good or bad, and I need to make the payments out of the money that I do have at the end of the day. So you could think of doing VCG with limited liability, and the same tricks work. Something that I think is really interesting and hard because you won't get close to efficiency. You won't be able to. You learn too late in some sense. So it really requires different tools. But I think this is a really important problem. Is just consumption. Forget about the agency problem. Just think about dynamic optimal consumption with saving and risk aversion in an environment where you have a lot of uncertainty about the process. And it's kind of what, if you think of an endowment, that's really what they're worried about. They have a 50-year horizon. The world is going to be very non-stationary over 50 years. And so even though, Harvard is making 15% in endowment, it's only spending 5% a year. What? They wish? Right. Harvard is making, only 14% on its endowment this year. But it's only spending 5% on consumption. So Harvard has to become infinitely rich in the future, which we should all desire. But really, you can think about it as, well, they don't know that they're going to be making 15% forever into the future, right? Like at that time scale, things are going to be very non-stationary. And this, I don't know what is the right solution. I know that anyway. You can't converge. You can't be close to efficiency. I'm struggling for good ways to state that problem to have some useful insights out of this. All right, that's all I had for today. Thank you very much.